All right. Can people hear me okay? Okay, great. Wonderful. Thanks, Greg, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming to the meeting, both in person. I know we have an audience online as well to talk about multiple myeloma and hear things that are recently coming into being developed in multiple myeloma that hopefully will be applicable to you as patients as you see your physicians in the clinic. And so over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be talking about sort of a general concept of moving novel concepts forward in the frontline treatment settings. Essentially, how do we move promising treatments that are initially approved in late line multiple myeloma to earlier lines of therapy and eventually newly diagnosed patients? These are my disclosures. So really over the next, again, 20 minutes, I'll be talking about clinical trials and kind of some general principles of myeloma drug approval process. And then I'll be talking a little bit about the application of clinical trial data into real world practice. So myeloma in 2023 really involves treatment initially with induction therapy with a combination of protease inhibitors, immunomodulatory drugs like bortezomib and lenalidomide, plus or minus a drug called daratumumab, which is an anti-CD38 monoclonal antibody. Then oftentimes we do a form of consolidation therapy in the form of autologous stem cell transplant in patients who are fit enough to undergo the procedure. And then typically then we undergo, patients would then proceed with something called maintenance therapy, usually with single agent lenalidomide or Revlimid until their myeloma progresses. But ultimately, and unfortunately, myeloma largely still considered incurable still in 2023. And at some point, the myeloma may recur. And at which time we'd then restart treatments with additional combinations of drugs, usually combinations of monoclonal antibodies, protease inhibitors like bortezomib or carfilzomib, IMiDs like lenalidomide or pomalidomide, and potentially alkylating combinations like cyclophosphamide. And some of the newer drugs that have come into this space include BCMA-directed CAR T therapies and bispecific T-cell antibodies. So one of the great things about multiple myeloma treatment over the last 10 to 20 years has been there's been tremendous advancements in the treatment of multiple myeloma during this time period. And this really started in the early 2000s with the initial approvals of drugs like bortezomib and lenalidomide, which were landmark approvals in the multiple myeloma treatment landscape. And as you can see here, over the last 10 years or so, there's been a number of additional drug approvals that have led to really tangible, measurable benefits, both in progression-free survival, which is essentially how long the myeloma is under control, but actually overall survival is also patients are actually living better and living longer with some of these advances. And there's additional really promising therapies coming down the pipeline. So there's drugs called bispecific T-cell antibodies targeting other sort of targets in myeloma known as GPRC5D and FCHR5, essentially next generation IMiDs, so next generation drugs that act similarly to pomalidomide and lenalidomide, and some other drugs like BCL2 inhibitors like venetoclax. Another way to think about myeloma drugs is based on their mechanism of action or drug class. And so basically, there's different classes of drugs that we use in multiple myeloma. You can see here that there's drugs like protease inhibitors like bortezomib, carfilzomib, and ixazomib. There's immunomodulatory drugs like thalidomide, lenalidomide, and pomalidomide. Monoclonal antibodies like daratumumab, isatuximab, and elotuzumab. Bispecific T-cell antibodies like teclistamab. CAR T therapies, including ide-cel and cilta-cel, and an XPO1 inhibitor known as selinexor. And so this is a way that we as physicians and also patients, we think about drug classes and how we would approach treatment for a patient in the clinic. And so there's a term that we often use in myeloma called triple class refractory myeloma. So this is something that it's used in clinical trials a lot if you hear updates from different meetings. And essentially, this means that the myeloma is resistant to sort of the main three classes of drugs, including IMiDs, anti-CD38 monoclonal antibodies, and protease inhibitors. So this is known as triple class multiple myeloma. So the question is how do drugs initially approved in late relapse refractory multiple myeloma move to earlier lines of therapy? And to kind of illustrate this, I kind of want to do a case study and kind of walk you through how a drug that we use often now called daratumumab moved from initial approval to now actually in the use of newly diagnosed myeloma. So initially, daratumumab was approved in essentially heavily relapsed refractory multiple myeloma patients. And so essentially in 2015, the Food and Drug Administration approved daratumumab under the accelerated approval program in patients with 3 prior lines of therapy, including a protein inhibitor immunomodulatory drug, and who were double refractory to a protein inhibitor immunomodulatory drug, regardless of lines of therapy. And this is based on what we call a single arm phase 2 study. So all the patients received single agent daratumumab, and about 100 patients or so. The patients had a median of 5 lines of prior therapy. The majority of patients were resistant to drugs like protein inhibitors and immunomodulatory drugs. And the overall response rate was 29%. And the reason why I mentioned the number is that generally speaking, it was lower, but clearly there was a response and activity. And basically the myeloma was kept under control for about 4 months or so with the addition of daratumumab. And so again, this led to the accelerated approval of daratumumab in 2015. So what does the word accelerated approval mean? So we hear this word accelerated approval by the Food and Drug Administration. Sometimes the Food and Drug Administration can approve a drug in a program, an accelerated approval program, really to treat certain serious conditions that fill an unmet need based on preliminary measures of efficacy and safety. So this is how drugs sometimes in myeloma are approved through an accelerated approval program. But it's contingent on that another study shows that the clinical benefit of the drug is proven. And so essentially for full approval, another trial has to be done, usually a randomized phase 3 trial where the drug is compared to perhaps the current standard of care. And so if the confirmatory study doesn't show clinical benefits, and then potentially the drug could be withdrawn by the FDA. And there's some recent examples in myeloma about this with panobinostat, melflufen, and belantamab mafodotin. So this is where the accelerated approval process and confirmatory studies are relevant. The other question is, I mentioned, what's a line of therapy? So we use the word line of therapy. So what does that mean? And so there's actually, from a myeloma clinician standpoint, there's actually strict definitions that are sometimes used more loosely or strictly in different contexts. But really a single line of therapy consists of if a patient has completed 1 cycle of a single drug or a combination of several drugs, like Velcade, Relevant, dexamethasone would be a combination of drugs, or a planned sequence of therapy. So a newly diagnosed myeloma patient may undergo induction therapy with a combination of drugs, followed by transplant, followed by maintenance therapy, and this would be a single line of therapy. And a new line of therapy is basically when you start a new treatment regimen or after discontinuation of a previous line. So really for any reason. So if a patient experiences side effects or toxicity to a certain line of therapy and then changes to another combination of drugs, that would be a second line of therapy. And then also the unplanned addition or substitution of 1 or more drugs would also be considered a change in the line of therapy. So for instance, if a patient experienced neuropathy with Velcade or bortezomib, which is a common side effect, and switch to a different drug that doesn't cause neuropathy, that would be considered a switch to a different line of therapy. And then finally, what does the word refractory mean? So essentially we use the word refractory a lot in myeloma lingo and jargon. And so basically it means that you're not responding to your current therapy, or you have progression of the myeloma. So myeloma parameters are increasing on or within 60 days of stopping current therapy in patients who have at least responded initially to therapy. So this is what we call refractory. So when we say patients are refractory to certain drug classes or individual drugs, this is what we mean by refractory. So really the next questions after initial drug approval is that if the drug is safe and efficacious in patients with many, many lines of prior therapy, is it safe and does it add efficacy when used in earlier lines of therapy compared to the current standard of care? And also, is it safe and efficacious when it's combined? So oftentimes we use treatments in combination because they have added benefit and synergy when you use drugs in combination. So is there synergy and there's added efficacy when combined with other approved myeloma drugs compared to the current standard of care? So this was sort of the next step with daratumumab. And so basically this was looked at in earlier lines of prior therapy. So in 2016, and actually these trials had been ongoing even before the approval of daratumumab, the daratumumab then received full FDA approval for myeloma patients, and basically with 1 prior line of therapy, either in combination with lenalidomide and dexamethasone, or in combination with bortezomib and dexamethasone. And again, the purpose of showing these numbers is not necessarily for you to know these numbers, but to show that there's actually a pretty significant added magnitude of benefit with the addition of daratumumab with current standard of care versus the standard of care. And this not only led to an improvement of disease control, but actually survival. So patients actually took daratumumab in these settings actually lived longer with longer follow-up. And in 2017, another trial showed that the combination of daratumumab with pomalidomide and dexamethasone also was efficacious and safe. And so this led to the approval of daratumumab, pomalidomide, and dexamethasone with patients at least 2 prior lines of therapy. And then in 2020, there was a clinical trial that was published that showed that daratumumab could be combined safely and efficaciously with carfilzomib and dexamethasone. So carfilzomib is a newer drug that we use in relapsed refractory myeloma than, for instance, Velcade, so hence the approval is a little bit later. But again, this was based on a large clinical trial published in 2020. So the next question is, well, if it works in earlier relapsed refractory multiple myeloma, then does it work well in newly diagnosed multiple myeloma? And indeed, actually just several years later, after the initial approval of daratumumab, there was a large clinical trial that was largely conducted in Europe that led to the FDA approval of daratumumab in combination with a regimen called bortezomib, melphalan, and prednisone in newly diagnosed multiple myeloma patients who were not planning to undergo stem cell transplant as initial therapy. And then in 2019, there was a clinical trial published that basically looked at daratumumab in combination with bortezomib, thalidomide, which is a drug that's more often used in Europe, and dexamethasone, who plan to undergo stem cell transplant. And in the same year, there's actually another clinical trial that led to the FDA approval of daratumumab in combination with lenalidomide and dexamethasone in newly diagnosed myeloma patients who were not planning to undergo stem cell transplant. So you can kind of see the sequence and the timeline of events of how the use of daratumumab has increased and basically moved in sort of earlier lines of therapy, including even in newly diagnosed patients. And so, for instance, now, as you may know, the backbone of newly diagnosed multiple myeloma treatment has been this regimen called BRD, or bortezomib, lenalidomide, and dexamethasone. And so there was a recent clinical trial published that showed that there was some benefit of adding daratumumab to Velcade, Revlimid, and dexamethasone in terms of the number of complete response rates and some early signals we call disease control or progression-free survival. And so this has been adopted in many of our practices of adding daratumumab to Velcade, Revlimid, and dexamethasone in newly diagnosed myeloma patients. It's not yet FDA approved because this was a little smaller trial. And so there's a larger trial looking at this exact combination. And probably the readout will be soon for this trial and could potentially lead to the FDA approval, the actual official FDA approval of daratumumab, Velcade, Revlimid, and dexamethasone in newly diagnosed myeloma patients. So again, you can kind of see how the timeline and sequence of events occur. So what about, so I think the reason why I kind of set the stage for that is that I think the main question we're getting in the clinic is, when are BCMA CAR T therapies and bispecific antibodies can be available for earlier relapsed refractory myeloma patients, even in newly diagnosed patients as well? And so it has to undergo a very similar iterative process. And so just to kind of give a little background, and not everyone may know about what CAR T therapy is. So CAR T therapy is a new modality of therapy, a newer modality of therapy that has been used to treat, in particularly, different types of blood cancers, initially lymphoma, and now other blood cancers like multiple myeloma. Essentially, this is a different type of drug than any other drug approved for multiple myeloma. Essentially, it's a living drug. And it's a living drug because essentially it involves a process where a patient's own immune cells, their own T cells, will be collected kind of in a similar fashion how stem cells are collected prior to a stem cell transplant. But then the patient's own immune cells will be sent to a manufacturing facility to basically engineer them to not necessarily recognize bacteria and viruses and help destroy infections, but to basically recognize the myeloma cells. And so that process takes about 4 to 6 weeks to basically be manufactured outside the body. And then the T cells will be then shipped back to the treating facility. And then the patient will usually be admitted to the hospital, although sometimes we can do this as an outpatient, where the T cells will be reinfused into the patient's body to hopefully kill a lot of myeloma cells. So that's the concept of chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapies. And actually, there's now 2 FDA approved for multiple myeloma. So there's a drug called idacapavir and viclucil, and this was FDA approved in March of 2021. and ciltacalcium autoleucel or cilta-cel or Carvykti, and this was FDA approved in February of 2022. Now, there's another really exciting class of drugs known as bispecific T-cell antibodies. And essentially, this is not a living drug. This is an antibody-based therapy. And so you can see the drug in green in the middle of the screen there. And essentially what happens is that this is a two-armed antibody, where one arm of the antibody will bind to a target on the myeloma cell. And usually this is BCMA or B-cell maturation antigen. And the other arm of the antibody will bind to the patient's own immune cell, usually a marker called CD3 on the T cell or immune cell. And basically bring the myeloma cell and the T cell in close proximity. It's like the kiss of death. Hopefully the immune cell will kill the myeloma cell, lead to a lot of myeloma cell killing. And so these have been also a very promising, exciting approach in the treatment of relapsed refractory multiple myeloma. Indeed, there's a number of BCMA bispecific T-cell antibodies currently in clinical development. Actually, the first one was FDA approved in October 2022, teclistamab. There's another one that may soon be approved called elranatamab in the second to the left on the bottom there. And so again, this is a very exciting modality of treatment for the treatment of relapsed refractory multiple myeloma. So the current FDA approval for BCMA CAR-T and bispecific T-cell antibodies is basically in patients with relapsed refractory multiple myeloma with at least 4 or more lines of prior therapy. So remember how I discussed what lines of therapy means, including a proteasome inhibitor, an immunomodulatory agent, and an anti-CD38 monoclonal antibody. And so, understandably, this is the patient population that the drugs were initially studied in that led to the FDA approval. But, in reality, the lines of therapy can be a challenge actually from a practical standpoint when we're seeing a patient in clinic. And so, and the reason is that, how we define lines of therapy and refractory status can define slightly different patient populations. And, I guess the question is, what's more relevant? Is lines of therapy more relevant or refractoriness to drug classes more relevant? And indeed, there's actually been very recent studies actually just published this year that have actually shown that actually refractory status, so if patients are refractory to certain classes of drugs like proteasome inhibitors, immunomodulatory drugs, or anti-CD3 antibodies, is actually a much better predictor of overall response and progression-free survival or disease control than lines of therapy. And so why this is relevant is that sometimes I may see a patient in clinic that by the time they're in second or third line therapy, they may be refractory to the 3 main classes of drugs: proteasome inhibitors, immunomodulatory drugs, and anti-CD38 monoclonal antibodies. And this creates a challenge because I really want to give, and they should probably get, a BCMA CAR-T or bispecific T-cell antibody, but this does create a little bit of vacuum of delivering potentially optimal therapy for patients in third or fourth line therapy. And so I think this is being looked at a lot, particularly amongst the myeloma community, the FDA, and things like that, how we can really better define appropriate patient populations for approvals of these particular therapies. So what about CAR-T in earlier lines of therapy? So this is a very, very common question that we get in the clinic. So when is CAR-T going to be available in earlier lines of therapy? And so actually there was a recent paper published last year that looked at, or actually earlier this year, that looked at CAR-T in 2 to 4 prior lines of therapy. This is with the CAR-T prior ida-capsid biclucin or ide-cel or Abecma. And this compared basically Abecma versus standard myeloma treatments in patients with 2 to 4 prior lines of therapy. And then there was actually a press release by Janssen, which makes cilta-cel or Carvykti, that they had a trial that looked at their CAR-T product, Carvykti, in 1 to 3 prior lines of therapy compared to the current standard of care, and that showed that there was a positive study. That's all we know about this announcement so far, and more data about this will be probably forthcoming in a future meeting. And then what about newly diagnosed patients? So there's actually an ongoing trial actually comparing CAR-T therapies, in this particular case, Carvykti or cilta-cel, compared to autologous stem cell transplant, which is the current standard of care in newly diagnosed multiple myeloma patients. And so I do want to emphasize that we need to wait for the data. And so, while CAR-T is promising in many settings, we still need to wait for the data. And so in particular, stem cell transplant has been tried and tested in many different contexts and they'll always come on top. And so we do need to wait for the data to see if CAR-T indeed is superior to autologous stem cell transplant in this context. So this is sort of where the field is moving. So where does this all lead? So myeloma in 2033, so myeloma 2023. So I kind of showed you the initial slide of how the treatment paradigm, how we treat multiple myeloma. So my one thought and one sort of hope is that we would treat multiple myeloma with some form of induction therapy, perhaps an anti-CD38 monoclonal antibody protease inhibitor IMiD combination. We may do some form of consolidation with a multi-antigen CAR T therapy or bispecific T cell antigen engager, and then do some form of maintenance therapy. Hopefully, when we say fixed duration, so maybe a finite period of time until a patient achieves what we call sustained minimal residual disease negativity, so sustained deep responses to therapy. And even with these approaches, it's likely that patients will still relapse on their therapy, and so at some point the myeloma may still come back, even with moving these new therapeutic approaches to earlier lines of therapy. The hope is that perhaps there's a fraction of patients that be cured with these approaches down the road. So that's the ultimate sort of goal of moving these lines earlier in the treatment course. And so really in summary, I kind of talked about the process of how myeloma drugs are evaluated initially in the relapse refractory setting, and then eventually move to earlier lines of therapy and even newly diagnosed myeloma patients. They've been studied in context of monotherapy or in combinations with other drugs. There's ongoing clinical trials looking at bispecific T cell antibodies and CAR T therapies in earlier relapse refractory multiple and newly diagnosed patients. And again, the whole paradigm of refractory versus lines of therapy, that's an ongoing, I think, thing that we're looking at as in the myeloma community of what's a better definition of how we would define appropriate patient populations for certain therapies. But really the take home message is that the future is really bright in the field. And so you can see how there's really treatments are coming down in late line myeloma that are being looked at in earlier lines of therapy. And so really the treatment of myeloma continues to accelerate and progress continues to be made. So thank you very much.